Frank Lloyd Wright believed he could build anything from a cathedral to a chicken coop, and all would be beautiful. His career spanned 70 years, and Wright became known as America's greatest architect. He completed more than 400 unique buildings throughout the world. Over 40 of them are found in Wisconsin, Wright's birthplace. A passionate man, Wright lived by the words, "Form and function are one." This flamboyant architect designed homes, office towers, and regal hotels from California to Michigan to Tokyo. But he always returned to his home state to live and work. His own home, Taliesin, is built into the rolling hillsides of southwest Wisconsin near Spring Green. Taliesin, Welsh for shining brow, is the place where Wright found his spiritual solace, where he could touch nature, the source of his vision of pure organic architecture. Here he established the Taliesin Fellowship, a school where young apprentices could study with Wright and could, in turn, carry on his architectural vision. This program explores 3 eras in the career of Frank Lloyd Wright and examines 3 types of buildings constructed in southeast Wisconsin. First, places for living, private homes for blue-collar workers, as well as a townhouse for a prosperous politician. Then a place for work, the corporate headquarters of a premier Racine industry. And finally, a place for worship, for a Greek immigrant congregation. 3 eras in the career of Frank Lloyd Wright, spanning 40 years of innovative architecture for home, work, and worship.
What is a house anyway? Did you ever ask yourself that question? It isn't just a pile of brick, stone, wood, and cement. It is a place for joy and peace, an expression of all that is best and sweetest in the lives of the people who live there. It should be beautiful.
Prior to 1916, Frank Lloyd Wright proved he could build beautiful homes. But what about the challenge of designing within small budgets or on city lots? Wright's passionate solution to the problem of distinctive housing for the masses is found in the groundbreaking business venture called the American System Built Homes. Wright told an audience of businessmen in 1916, "Simply selling houses at less cost means nothing to me. To sell beautiful houses at less cost means everything. A beautiful house means a truer, better house in every way."
He always had an eye to make housing that was not only affordable for people, but also beautiful.
His kind of idea was if you live in a beautiful place, you'd have beautiful thoughts.
The exterior is different, full of a lot of clever use of lines.
I think the windows are beautiful. There's so much light, and it's so special.
The windows are relatively small, but there's just tons of them.
These Burnham Street duplexes and cottages were built on Milwaukee's South Side, a working class to middle income area. They are the longest continuous stretch of Frank Lloyd Wright homes in the world. 4 duplex rental apartments and 2 small cottages. In 1990, they were declared a Milwaukee Historic District.
I think the first time that I woke up in this house was very special. We came downstairs and we were drinking coffee, and I looked out, and there was my neighbor's Frank Lloyd Wright house. I looked out the other window. There was my other neighbor's Frank Lloyd Wright house. And I realized we lived in the most special place in the world.
The Industrial Revolution changed the landscape of the city. Populations shifted from the country to urban centers. Architects faced the new challenge of providing low-cost housing for the new urban working-class family. In contrast to the rest of the neighborhood, Wright's homes offered not only cost efficiency, but also beauty. Each home, apartment, or townhouse had its own personal individuality.
This was one of Wright's really first executed attempts to deal with that situation. He wanted to make housing that was special, that had a lot of the qualities, I think, that he put into a lot of the homes he had that he designed for millionaires. Here it has a lot of those elements, a lot of the things he learned about, But of course, it's all been really done on a scale that the average person could afford.
I think when an architect is given the luxury of a large budget, a large amount of space, there is not as much scope for the imagination. You have to use those limited resources, and that's where the genius comes in. They are part of the everyday life of the neighborhood, and that's kind of what Wright wanted. He didn't want these homes to stick out or be oddball places.
Wright had said, "The idea behind the American system has been in my head for years. I have guarded it carefully and wanted time to think in quiet of how the idea might be brought to the public without injury to the integrity of my own art." Wright had been developing the American system for years, but his teaming up with Arthur L. Richards turned theory into practice. Richards, a major player in Milwaukee's real estate market, met Wright while they were working together on a previous project. Their ideas meshed. A true artist combined with a shrewd businessman, and the American System Built Homes partnership was born.
Richards was a premier Milwaukee home builder. He was the Babe Brothers of 1915. He built bungalow after bungalow. There were caricatures of him in the paper sitting astride a house with a hammer. He was known all over the city as a residential real estate developer. And he and Wright had developed this system almost as a franchise.
There were advertisements that were designed and put into Chicago Tribune, for example, advertising the homes.
The ads sold not only the homes, but especially the architect himself.
Let us tell you a little about Frank Lloyd Wright. He is an American boy like you and me. And here is the first American architect whose designs have been studied in every great city of the world. You see, Mr. Wright is a really big artist as well as a big architect. He can afford to be simple and unpretentious. Think it over yourself. The thing you want to know is that you get a beautiful house at less cost than an ugly one. And remember the big story. Any American System Built house you get will be designed for you by Frank Lloyd Wright. It will be beautiful.
Richards was a big thinker. Richards wasn't going out and building one or two houses. Richards thought big, and they thought the entire South Side should be built like this. And these 6 homes were put in as a parade of homes, and they thought it would catch on like wildfire. Richards and Wright thought they had a scheme where they would make many, many dollars.
In all my work from the beginning, I have had faith in the machine as the characteristic tool of my times, therefore an artist's tool. The machine revolutionized Wright's designs and construction methods. Prefabrication today is commonplace, but in 1916, bringing pre-manufactured units to the site for assembly was a novel idea. The home buyer was offered a variety of floor plans with interchangeable parts to create custom-designed homes. The same units could be assembled to form the entire line of housing, from single-family cottages to 4-family apartment buildings.
He realized in a factory setting you could control the quality of the construction much more readily than on site. So he was toying with, he was toying with this back in 1910, 1911. And so what he wanted to do was have a house design that you could change pieces with and give a lot of variety to visually and aesthetically without really changing a lot of the pieces of it. So you could control the manufacturing process and go to many places around the country and put these types of houses up, and yet not have them all look like they came out of a factory, a cookie cutter type of a thing. I had been discussing architecture with someone I worked with and was kind of thinking about trying to purchase a home with some architectural uniqueness to it. And she had mentioned, she looked at me, she said, "Well, had you ever seen the Frank Lloyd Wright houses on the South Side?" And I said, "There's nothing on the South Side." And I'd been living on the East Side at the time, and it was kind of a typical attitude. But I came down out of curiosity and turned the corner on this block and was just stunned. And it didn't look like, from the condition of the homes, it didn't look like there had been that much interest in the places.
Most of the houses on this block suffered from neglect or were overlooked as authentic Wright creations. When David and Ghislaine Arena purchased their home in 1981, they took on the enormous task of restoring it. To cut costs, they did much of the work themselves.
All the woodwork had been painted typically in the 50s. It was all, people had stuck paneling on the walls. The floors had all been carpeted or covered with stick tile, or none of the fixtures had been updated. But underneath all that, I mean, I looked at that and I said, these are surface things. The basic structure, the architecture, the detail, the vistas of the windows, the layout, the efficiency, the play of light was all there. And that's all really I was interested in. I knew I could bring it back.
Working every Wednesday night for 6 months, David and a friend made a total of over 60 windows for the house. He copied the stained glass pattern Wright planned for the American System homes, which the builder never used.
There were times, I will admit, that I would have sold this house for a quarter. And that I had, for many years, a love-hate relationship with the house. But when the work was finished, it has been its own reward.
As Wright himself had done with his own homes, the Arenas made renovations to meet their own needs by changing the duplex to a single-family home.
We approached it very carefully. We felt that Wright continually adapted his homes and his studios. Are we keepers of history? Are we building a museum here, or are we building a house? And that's a question, and we had to struggle with that. And we felt that we were living in a house, and this was living architecture, and that's the spirit of Frank Lloyd Wright.
Much to the surprise of Wright and Richards, the American System-built homes did not catch on, and only a handful more were actually built. The idea failed mainly because of unfortunate timing. But Wright applied the basic principles he developed in 1915 to future challenges of small house designs throughout his long career.
Right after they were completed, the United States entered World War I. All of the building materials that had been diverted to the war effort, and construction virtually came to a standstill. So again, it was unfortunate timing on his part to launch this effort. But they still stand as a testimony to the ideas which he resurrected later in his career with the advent of the Usonian home.
Many people think that the Usonian homes were his first toying with kind of a democratic view of architecture, but really these homes were the first quite early in his career, and very committed to them.
Wright's commitment to this project is revealed by the vast quantity of drawings he made for the American System homes. It is the largest portfolio for a single project in the Frank Lloyd Wright archives.
I don't think he did 900 drawings for obviously anything else. This was a project of passion. This was a project of tremendous interest. I think he felt this was the challenge of an architect's career. This was the challenge of art. How do you make art for everyone? It's one thing to have art for the elite, but it's another thing to say everybody deserves beauty.
I mean, living here is a treat. It's just a delight. I still never get tired of enjoying the beauty that he created.
Wouldn't we all be better off if we all lived in a beautiful place?
Another of Wright's beautiful places was taking shape at about the same time in a different neighborhood. This elegant townhouse, designed for a specific family, is located on Milwaukee's prestigious East Side. The client was Alderman Frederick C. Boak, who was also successful in real estate and insurance. There is every indication Boak met Wright through their mutual acquaintance with Arthur Richards. Before evolving into its current form, the design for the home sported a flat roof and a two-story living room with balcony. The house stayed in the Boak family until the 50s. Robert and Barbara Elsner, the current owners, purchased the house in 1955.
It had nothing to do with being a Wright house. We had 4 kids under 4, and it was for sale. I remember stopping in front and realizing that it looked interesting and wanted to see the interior. It had beer steins and an enormous television set and the original rugs, and it was structurally wonderful. The decorating was impossible.
The Elsners wrote to Wright shortly after the purchase. Wright promptly replied, "Congratulations, a good house of a good period for a good client." Other more famous Wright buildings of the period have overshadowed the Boak House. The Imperial Hotel in Tokyo and Midway Gardens in Chicago. Unfortunately, both have been demolished.
Well, some people call it the Imperial Hotel period, which is very brief. It certainly is not a prairie house, and he himself referred to it as a townhouse. It precedes the houses in California. It's very vertical and is not as horizontal, partly because it's in a very narrow lot. It's very close to the Unity Temple, in a sense, in Oak Park, although the roof line was changed, but his initial drawings were the same flat plan. This house was never written about much because most people that have written about Wright's architecture up until very recently were really using his own autobiography and the lectures, his famous lectures at Princeton. And if he talked about that period this house was built, he certainly would have focused more on the Imperial Hotel or the Midway Gardens, which preceded this house. So the house was never mentioned. Well, then I think in the late 70s or early 80s, David Hanks, who has become a specialist in the decorative arts of Wright, had a photograph of the rug in his book. And then subsequently there were a lot of mentionings of the rug, and it was in calendars and so forth.
The Boak House is a rare example of what a home could become when Wright's vision shaped not only the physical structure, but extended throughout the interior design as well. The Elsners have remained true to that vision.
All the furniture that was designed for this house particularly we own. Unfortunately, the Boaks ran out of money, so it's not all through the house, but the entire dining room set, which is 2 tables and 10 chairs, was designed by Wright, as well as this desk and the built-in furniture. It was built by Niedecken Walbridge Company. Niedecken had worked with Wright for quite a few years in the interior.
The original rugs were intact, but very worn when the Elsners moved in, so new rugs were woven from the original design after Wright's death. However, his widow, Olga Vanna, made up new color choices for the carpets and fabrics to brighten up the house.
She recommended orange. She sent an orange thread. And yeah, I think we looked at an orange thread for 2 years. And then we finally had 2 different samples of weaving made, small. And I think we looked at those for 2 more years, because at that time, no, I had never seen an orange rug. This was the palette that Wright was using at the time, really, which reflects Arizona more than the character of this house. We did finally decide to go ahead and have that rug made.
The Boak House is on the National Register of Historic Places, and though it was built over 75 years ago, it feels contemporary.
Even though the house was built in 1916, it wasn't contemporary in age. Well, I think it's still contemporary. The house moves well. I mean, the flow of the house is wonderful. It's fabulous for entertaining because it's all open space. And visually, it's joy frequently. When the sun comes out, there's a great deal of joy, and of course the built-in fish pond was always a draw. A friend of mine once said it was like living in a piece of sculpture, and I think that's a very good description.
Frank Lloyd Wright went beyond the notion of a house being a simple structure of mortar, wood, and nails. He envisioned a home as a living piece of sculpture, molding and shaping it to the owner's needs, surrounding those who live in it with a sense of wonder and unique beauty, a perfect balance between art and architecture, for all people who want a place of their own to truly call home. The 20 years from 1916 to 1936 were especially turbulent for Wright. He had few clients and enormous financial debt. He struggled to overcome an overwhelming tragedy at his beloved Taliesin. In 1914, a crazed servant had set his home ablaze, murdering Wright's lover and her children. Wright was devastated. Years passed, and his pain and suffering faded only when he met the love of his life and spark to his genius, Olgivanna. Their marriage brought new life and energy to a man nearly 60, who was, in some circles, thought of as a once great but now retired architect. In the depth of the Depression, Wright and Olgivanna began the Taliesin Fellowship. It was a resounding intellectual success, but financially the Wrights remained on the edge. In 1935, at one of Wright's lowest points, he received a commission for a summer home in Pennsylvania. This cantilevered home, suspended over a river, has come to be known as Falling Water. Falling Water was a turning point in his career. The next year, 1936, Wright was to accept a Wisconsin commission, which became one of the greatest achievements in corporate industrial architecture.
Let's not try to build only a bigger business. Let's not let mere size be the goal of our ambitions. Let's build a finer, more perfect corporation to make our chosen life's work fine and more enjoyable.
By the spring of 1936, the S.C. Johnson & Son Company had outgrown its facilities in Racine, Wisconsin. The company, a highly successful wax and paint manufacturer, was headed by Herbert F. Johnson, the president and grandson of the company founder. The firm was prospering, and Johnson felt that their current facility was antiquated and too scattered among a number of outdated buildings. He felt he needed to do something to improve his employees' working conditions. He wanted to, in his words,
eliminate the drabness and dullness we so often find in office buildings.
Johnson had more artistic inclinations than most in the corporate business world. He wanted to create a beautiful, pure, and completely American image for his company. After examining several office complexes throughout the country for ideas and inspirations, Johnson commissioned J. Mander Matson, a prominent local architect, to design an office building that was air-conditioned, artistic, and uplifting. Matson proposed a 3-story Beaux-Arts building. It was air-conditioned, windowless, and completely lit by skylights. But Johnson wasn't satisfied with Matson's design. It just wasn't good enough. It was just another building. To try to improve on the design, Johnson sent out his staff to collect input from other architects and design firms around the country. Many seemed interested in the project, but one architect, a Mr. Raftery of Chicago, told them,
"Although I would like a crack at redesigning your building, I feel that your needs and desires could only be met by one person. There is a native Wisconsinian who is the absolute father of all modern architecture in the world, and it would be a shame not to talk to him. That man is Frank Lloyd Wright."
At that time, Wright's practice at the Taliesin School was just beginning to revive from a long and empty dry spell. Taliesin was Wright's kingdom, hidden among the rolling hills of Spring Green, Wisconsin. At Taliesin, students from around the country not only learned architecture from Wright, but were responsible for maintaining the buildings, cooking the meals, and even tending the crops that grew in the fields surrounding the school. These young people were more than students. They were servants and disciples of Wright. And Wright, in turn, lorded over them with his theories and rules about architecture and life as a whole. He truly was king in his peaceful rural domain. Wright had heard about the Johnson project at an art directors meeting held at Taliesin. He showed a great interest in the project. The Johnson Company's enlightened treatment of employees appealed to him, and he felt it might give him an ideal chance to work on a project that expressed many of his recent design theories. In July of 1936, a staff of aides representing Herbert Johnson made a drive out to Taliesin to interview Wright and hear his design ideas. The apprentices went feverishly to work to upgrade the look of the ill-funded school. Windows were washed, the grounds raked, and the floors cleaned and waxed. When the Johnson people arrived, Wright showed them the entire grounds, the school, and the theater. They later sat down to an elegant lunch and tea as Wright made his proposal. It was, in the words of one apprentice, masterful and a shocker. Wright's design was not to be built on the company's current site near the downtown area, as Johnson intended. Instead, Wright would raze the old buildings and move the entire facility 4 to 5 miles west of town. He proposed a Johnson Village built around the factory, with homes for employees and even a shopping center. He wanted them to move out where there was room to breathe. Johnson's general manager, Jack Ramsey, was at that presentation. Ramsey was considered a straight-laced, no-nonsense executive who didn't relate well to artistic endeavors. Yet he immediately became excited about Wright's ideas and anxiously drafted a letter to Johnson, who was vacationing in the North Woods. In the letter he wrote,
"I honestly haven't had such inspiration from a person in years, and I won't feel satisfied about your getting what you want until you talk to him. He's very easy to talk to, much interested in our job whether he has anything to do with it or not. Because it hits on his ideas of modern building, because it's a Wisconsin native proposition, and because it seems to hurt his artistic conscience to see so much money spent on something ordinary."
Johnson made an appointment to see Wright the following day. Wright liked to meet with prospective clients one-on-one, so Johnson had a private lunch with Wright and Wright's wife, Olgivanna. All three people were known to have dominating personalities, and sparks flew almost as soon as Johnson arrived. Said Johnson,
"He insulted me, and I insulted him, but he did a better job. I came back from Spring Green and said, if that guy can talk like that, he must have something. Everything at Spring Green was run down. He had a Lincoln Zephyr, and I had one. That was the one thing we agreed on. On all other matters, we were at each other's throats."
Johnson pleaded with Wright not to make his building too unconventional. Laughing, Wright answered him, "Then you came to the wrong man. You'd better find yourself another architect. The Johnson administration building is not going to be what you expect, but I can assure you of one thing. You'll like it when it is up." Conceded Johnson,
"It's okay with me, then, if you think so. We'll have your kind of building, not the kind of building I had in mind."
Despite the insults and personality clashes, Johnson was immensely impressed with Wright's design ideas and basic artistic integrity after only that one meeting. 2 days later, even though ground was being broken for the Matson building, Johnson wrote to Matson that the company had decided not to build on his designs. In a second letter, he offered the Johnson Administrative Building Commission to Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright received Johnson's letter of commission while at his drafting table at Taliesin. Upon reading it, he shouted to the apprentices in the workroom, "It's all right, boys. We got the job." And he proudly held up the $1,000 advance check. Wright was elated. It was Taliesin's first big, solid commercial project. Wright's elation was soon deflated following a preliminary meeting with Johnson and Ramsey. As impressed as Johnson was, some of Wright's ideas still seemed extravagant, which caused a major disagreement between architect and client. Johnson wanted the building to be built near the company's existing plant in Racine, not 5 miles out into the countryside. Due to his unwillingness to give in, Wright nearly lost the commission altogether. Upon returning to Spring Green, he reported the conflict to Olgivanna. She simply told him to give them what they wanted. Taliesin could not afford to lose this job. Despite his concessions, Wright started in on the new designs with great relish. In his autobiography, he wrote, "What release of pent-up creative energy, the making of those plans. Ideas came tumbling up and out onto the paper to be thrown back in heaps for careful scrutiny. The plans included a large workroom with rows of mushroom-like columns that stretched to the ceiling, a 17-foot deep mezzanine surrounding the room on the second level, a presentation theater, glass skylights lining the roof, a large carport, rooftop penthouses, gardens, and squash courts, and all falling into Wright's notion of integrating man into nature. It was Wright's practice to pass on his basic ideas and sketches to apprentices like Edgar Toffel, John Howe, and William Wesley Peters, who would then work out the finished drawings with Wright's guidance. The apprentices worked day and night. When Wright was unsure of a detail, he circled it on the drawing. Frequently, he went to bed puzzling over an unresolved detail and awoke before dawn with a solution. When the apprentices came to the drafting room to start their day, they found the circle erased and a new detail drawn in by Wright. Barely 10 days since he had begun, Wright was ready to show Johnson his scheme. On August 9, 1936, Wright met with Johnson and other executives with a presentation that was dramatic and to the point. He described the problems with the building site, wax and paint factories to the west, movie houses, stores and residential homes on all the other sides. There was nothing to look out to, no views. So Wright turned everything inward. He couldn't get the building out into nature, so he created the feeling of nature indoors. Johnson and the executives received the project enthusiastically. Wright's relationship with Johnson was now growing very close. Johnson appreciated Wright's wisdom and creative energy, while Wright was thrilled to have a client that let him have the freedom he needed to put all of his design theories to work. That freedom, however, proved to cause harsh disagreements between the two men as time went on. Initial construction of the administration building began in the fall of 1936. With excavation and basic foundation work underway, Wright encountered the first of many hurdles. Before the city of Racine would issue a building permit, the State Industrial Commission had to approve Wright's plans and specifications. Wright, insulted, refused to halt major construction over a permit and said, "If the state wants us to halt construction, let them call out the militia." Eventually, Johnson and Wright went before the commission, and with certain modifications in place, the permit was issued. There was, however, another hurdle on the horizon. In the spring of 1937, with construction well underway, the Wisconsin Industrial Commission denied permission to build the large mushroom columns, thinking them structurally unsound and unsafe. After much deliberation, it was agreed that Wright could build one column and test load it. If it could carry 12 tons without falling, construction of the columns could proceed. The column was set up at the building site in late May, with a test to be held on the 4th of June. A wooden platform was built on top of the circular pedal, and workmen, hoisted by a crane, began placing bags of sand in a ring on the platform. Inspectors, commissioners, and engineers looked on, along with Wright and carloads of apprentices from Taliesin. As the workmen loaded more and more bags, a crowd began to gather. At 12 tons, the state inspectors were satisfied. Wright, however, was not, and he ordered the test to continue. Even at 30 tons, Wright, enjoying the drama of the moment, ordered the crew to keep piling it on. A crane load of loose sand and even a load of pig iron was put on the platform. Wright stood confidently under the column, even kicking and hitting the base of it with his cane, defying it to come down. At 60 tons, with no room left on the platform, Wright ordered the column to be pulled down. With that test, new precedents for reinforced concrete construction were established. After the test, work on the building began anew. Area craftsmen, bricklayers, and laborers worked long and hard on a building the likes of which they'd never built before. Wright had devised new methods of mortar and bricklaying in specific patterns to be carried out throughout the building. A new approach to the massive ceiling skylights was attempted utilizing row upon row of glass Pyrex tubing caulked together in tight patterns that not only proved to be beautiful, but energy efficient as well. As the building started to rise, however, so did the costs. Wright had originally promised Johnson a building for $200,000. Within 5 months, it rose to $300,000. On December 30th, 1937, Wright warned that the revised estimate would be near $450,000. Angered by these cost overruns, Johnson wrote this to Wright.
I know it does no good to complain, as you are an artist so in love with your work that nothing will make you change your ideas of what the building might be, even though it works a hardship on your client. Why didn't you put me wise long ago as to the true costs and time to construct? Would that be unreasonable to ask? That is water under the dam now, and I'm going to have to take it. But I will never like it. The building, though, I'm going to love.
The relationship between the two men was becoming strained. But even though the costs and delays weighed heavy on him, Johnson still believed in Wright's vision. In the spring of 1939, well beyond its initial completion date, the Johnson Wax facility was finished and open to the public. With the addition of furnishing the building with the unique chairs, desks, and tables that were designed by Wright, the total cost was nearly $1 million, 5 times what Wright had proposed to Johnson at their private lunch in 1936. Despite the financial overruns, the building was a huge success. It was featured in national business and design magazines, associating the company with innovation and quality. Reporters were overwhelmed by the great workroom and wrote unusually lyrical stories. The financial editor of the Milwaukee Journal wrote,
"A silly urge comes over you to lie flat upon the bottom of this pool of liquid light and stare up at the lily pads of concrete that float upon its glassy surface."
26,000 people, over 1/3 of Racine's population, passed through the doors on April 22nd and 23rd, after waiting 2 hours in lines that extended for 2 city blocks. Beaming with pride and excitement, Herbert Johnson greeted many of the visitors. Life magazine even ran a feature article on the building in their May issue. In it, they wrote,
"The $155 million World's Fair is undeniably a great show, but future historians may well decide that a truer glimpse of the shape of things to come was given last week by a single structure built strictly for business, which opened in a drab section of Racine, Wisconsin."
Johnson turned to Wright again 4 years later when the company felt they needed to construct a facility for extensive research and development. Johnson was still hurting from the huge cost of the new building, but he also knew that Wright was the most qualified person to construct something to match the uniqueness and innovation of the administration building. Being fearful that Wright could too easily sway him into granting Wright the new commission, Johnson refused to speak with Wright and only corresponded through letters and telegrams. But in a surprise phone call to Johnson, Wright suggested that the proposed building go up into the air, and the idea for the research tower was born, securing the commission to Wright. Wright's initial plan for the research tower was a looming structure sitting just opposite the administration building. It was to be divided into rounded sections, or floors, all made of the same Cherokee red brick and sitting on a central access cylinder. The exterior walls, however, would be constructed of a similar pattern of glass Pyrex tubing that was used earlier in the skylight design. The tower would bring in sunlight during the day and give off its own illumination at night. In March of 1946, the company sent out a press release announcing plans for the new tower. It said, "The story of Frank Lloyd Wright's latest creation, a 15-story test tube to be built in Racine, Wisconsin for Johnson Wax, a laboratory the likes of which the world has never seen." Construction began in November of 1947. Because the design was so unique, utilizing a radically new structuring system, more poured concrete, specialized bricklaying, and miles of glass tubing, the tower was not completed until November of 1950. The response to the tower was similar to that of the administration building, overwhelming. Architectural magazines hailed it as a significant leap in architecture. Life magazine wrote,
"It seems like an outstretched electrical coil, standing on end and lit from within."
The tower was even featured in an exhibit mounted by New York's Museum of Modern Art. The tower became a symbol of the company's commitment to innovation. As Wright told Johnson, "You can raise it like a torch to inspire people around the world." The Johnson Wax buildings are a tribute to the genius and dedication of Frank Lloyd Wright and Herbert Johnson. Together, they prove that architect and client can combine their efforts and energies without compromise to ultimately create what was before thought impossible and impractical: beauty and harmony in the workplace. After the completion of the Johnson Wax complex, commissions poured in. Frank Lloyd Wright, now in his 70s, was on top of the world with a tremendous surge of unmatched creative energy. In 1937, he began to build winter headquarters for the Taliesin Fellowship near Scottsdale, Arizona. The construction of Taliesin West gave the apprentices the opportunity to apply the fellowship motto, learning by doing. During the 1940s and 50s, the majority of Wright's commissions were for private homes, but many of his best-known public structures were also built during this period. Price Tower in Oklahoma, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York City, Grady Gamage Auditorium in Arizona, and the Marin County Government Center in California. And in 1956, a small Greek immigrant congregation in Milwaukee asked the aging Frank Lloyd Wright to design a place for worship. This is a day of joy for little Nikitas and his family. It is his baptism according to ancient Greek Orthodox tradition. It is also his spiritual welcome into a church that has become an architectural mecca for millions of people around the world.
Certainly a great honor and notoriety that we have.
In some ways, it has been a real asset, a blessing for the church, and from their point of view, even as a witness to the rest of the world about who we are as a people of faith. At the same time, there's been a price to pay.
Frank Lloyd Wright's last large urban building in Wisconsin is the Annunciation Greek Orthodox Church. It was the dream of a small community of Greek immigrants and the vision of one of the world's most unorthodox architects.
To us, it is a church. To most of the visitors, and we have had, I would say, in excess of 2 or 3 million people go through. To most of the people, it's a house of God. To some people, it is an architectural masterpiece.
People do not come from Europe and South America and the West Coast to 92nd and Congress because there's an interesting congregation there. They come because Frank Lloyd Wright designed that building.
I remember the first church festival that we have in July, a very beautiful festival. One gentleman was leaving the church and saw me there with a collar on and mentioned, "Father, you ought to go in. It's a beautiful synagogue."
They hired Frank Lloyd Wright because they trusted him to give them a world-class building, one that would be in their tradition, and at the same time, something that was singular. By hiring Frank Lloyd Wright, they also assured themselves that they were going to have not just a world-class building, but a world-famous building. And what it raised was the question of, is this Wright's church or is this God's church?
It's a point of invitation for people to enter into the church. And once they see the magnificence of his work, it's always my prayer and my mission and my goal is that through that they will see the glory of God.
By 1952, the Annunciation community had outgrown its first church and needed to build another. But no one in this conservative, hard-working group of parishioners knew that the new church would end up costing 3 times the amount their building committee had budgeted. And no one would ever have guessed that these tradition-bound followers would also select the most controversial architect of the century.
I felt from the very beginning that whenever I was in his presence, that I was in the presence of a very great man.
2 young attorneys, Andy Sferis and Chris Seraphim, were on the building committee. Over dinner one fateful night in 1955, for the first time the name of Frank Lloyd Wright came up as a possible candidate. Without their intervention and support, Wright would not even have been considered for the job.
Sometime later, we went to Spring Green, a committee of us, about 4 or 5, and we had an audience with the master. And present was his wife, Ogilvana, and Wes Peters, who was his right-hand man. He said he would think about it. We had a very nice Spartan lunch made up of rather watered down chili. But I don't know if we'd ever remember how it tasted or what. We left there, and he said he would consider it. A few days later, we got word that he would see us again. And when we got there, he said no. Ogilvana spoke on our behalf because, as a Montenegrin, she was a Greek Orthodox as far as religion goes.
The role that Olgivana, Wright's third wife, played in this decision to accept the Greeks' commission is a matter of speculation. In the words of her son-in-law, Wes Peters, Mr. Wright took any interesting job. There is no doubt that she endorsed it, but Mr. Wright never would have rejected a job like that, where he established a contact with the conscience of people.
I think it was just an interesting idea that was presented to him by the Greeks. He had never worked in the Byzantine tradition, and I think that was a challenge that whetted his appetite.
And he called us back a third time, really, and said that he would do it. And I remember he said, we were having coffee at the time. His coffee cup was in the saucer. Took the cup out of the saucer, put it down, took the saucer and put it on top of the cup and said, that's what your church is going to look like. And he was right, that's what it looks like.
It's abstract on the one hand, but on the other hand, it is right down the center of the Byzantine architectural tradition. That's a rare accomplishment. Not many architects could do that.
A prime example of Byzantine tradition is St. Sophia, built in the 6th century in Constantinople. Design essentials are the huge central dome, use of arches, and a cross-shaped floor plan. Wright often called his Milwaukee church Little Sophia.
One of the things that makes that building absolutely unique in America, and one that makes it fit the clients so well, is that it is a Byzantine church. Like a lot of Wright's work, it's traditional, and at the same time, it's ageless.
One of 5 women in the world honored with the title Princess of the Church, and one of only 2 women on the building committee, Sophia Shane recalls her impression of Frank Lloyd Wright.
Age-wise, he was a dynamo. That man had so much energy, and he had a great personality. Once he started to talk, I think that everything else was forgotten because the man really had so much to offer, and when he spoke, you listened.
But not everyone in the congregation of 800 families shared her enthusiasm.
Many of our parishioners were quite vocal about their opposition to it. However, as it evolved, and sometimes it took a lot of arm twisting, conniving, and cajoling to get them all to agree. But when we finally did get the committee to agree, oddly enough, it was the older members of our church who were unanimously in favor of it.
Wright's design would undergo many revisions to meet the needs of the Greek congregation. The seating capacity of the first design was found to be insufficient, so he enlarged the space. This led some to complain that Wright's little jewel now looked more like a flying saucer. Another revision involved a hole in the center of the church floor.
In a medieval church, it might have looked down to a crypt. He didn't know that that's where the Greek Orthodox come down for communion. So you would have had these parishioners dropping like flies into the basement church hall. They told him what the problem was, and he closed it.
And I remember speaking to the committee and saying, well, this is ridiculous, this little 2x4 kitchen. Who is ever going to be able to work in there? And the answer was, oh, the women won't want to work in the kitchen. We'll have it all catered. Since that time, we have been able to produce thousands and thousands of pieces of pastry, and all from that little tiny kitchen. So I think it's the will to do that really prevails.
I think you have to temper questions about how functional this space is with how revolutionary the openness of the whole worship space was in a Greek Orthodox church.
We're a very liturgical church where ceremonies and church services are the focal point of our community life. And Frank Lloyd Wright and his committee and the church committee were hoping that the roundness of the church would be sort of a cup of faith. But liturgically for the clergy and the hierarchy and the faithful people of God, those who are attending services all the time, it makes it different because there are no long aisles coming to the holy altar. The focal point, unfortunately, is not the altar and the priest and the holy icons, the sanctity of the church. It seems to be the viewing of one another in that cup of faith.
While the cross is essential as the foundation of the church, the icons are equally important symbols. Icons are paintings of religious figures. They are central to Byzantine tradition. Worshippers kiss them and pray before them. Icons serve as a meeting point between heaven and earth. The services in most Greek Orthodox churches are conducted behind an icon screen, a wall separating priest from parishioners. Wright's innovative open grill work let the people see the sanctuary. At Olgivanna's suggestion, Wright asked Eugene Masalink to paint the icons for the screen. Masalink had done designs and murals in numerous Wright buildings, but had never painted icons before. In the words of Olgivanna Wright, "It almost killed him. It was very, very hard work, with his hands up all the time. He wasn't too well, but he did it, and he did beautiful work." Wright never saw Masalink's icon designs. At 91, the task of developing and completing his visions for the church were left in the capable hands of his Taliesin artists and apprentices. Wright would never see his little jewel built, for in April 1959, 5 weeks before the Annunciation Church would have its groundbreaking, Frank Lloyd Wright died. On May 17, 1959, Wright's widow, Olgivanna, joined the faithful to celebrate the groundbreaking. Taliesin's John Ottenheimer and Wes Peters were determined to carry out Wright's vision and make the imagined real. Despite their proven talents and ingenuity, there were problems, especially with the domed roof.
One of the problems they had was getting steel from suppliers that would be in sections that would follow the radius of the same curve, throughout the dome. And one of the stories that John Ottenheimer, who was a site architect, told was that they were all over the place when the steel arrived. None of the angles matched. And they called the engineers from the steel mill in, and they said it's a clear case of molecular memory. The steel was trying to get back to the form it had known back in the mill. And they had an electrician who was on the job site, a tradesman, who said, I can fix those with my hickey, which is a little device for bending conduit. And they laid them out on the ground outside the church, and the electrician got them all exactly where they should have been.
We had some of the dome fall. As a matter of fact, about 3 o'clock one morning after a reunion of the church choir, at which time both Judge Seraphim and I were there bellowing. Church service was over about 1 or 1:30, and at 3 o'clock, directly over where we were singing, were chanting why that portion of the ceiling fell.
Wes Peters always said that if a conventional roof fails, it's the contractor's fault, and if an unconventional roof fails, it's the architect's fault. Both will fail.
Construction had its problems, and money was a constant concern. Some extras would have to be postponed. Eugene Masalink's stained glass windows would have to wait.
When they finally had the money to do the windows, the impression on the church's part is that they tried to get the designs. The impression on Taliesin's part is that they never received the request.
As a result, the parish ended up going to a local studio that designed a representational Byzantine window. Masalink's windows exist only on paper.
And the original plan was to have yellow carpeting, gold carpeting, and a blue interior to the dome. The problem was that when you had light coming through the windows, blue and gold meshed to form green, which was unacceptable from everyone's point of view.
Work and alterations were made up to the last minute. On July 2nd, 1961, nearly 1,200 people gathered outside for the dedication of the new church. As the Archbishop was entering the church, the last workers were literally scrambling down the back stairs. Frank Lloyd Wright's vision could now be seen by everyone.
It's a great privilege to be known to be one of his works, but my goal as a spiritual father is to first let the people know that it's a house of God, an Orthodox house of God with our typical understandings of our theology inside the church, and then to enjoy the pleasures of the Frank Lloyd Wright design surrounding Orthodox theology, not the other way around.
The Annunciation Greek Orthodox Church is a church for all time, for all people, especially the little Nikitases born into the religious tradition of their ancestors. But the church the Greeks have built is not only a house of God, it is also a monument to the genius of its architect.
Everything Wright did was intended to elevate the human, to embody the dignity that humans should have. At the same time, there was a seamless border for Wright, I believe, between human dignity and something approaching divinity. The epitaph on his tombstone at Taliesin was, "Love of an idea is love of God."
This is PBS.